Okay, so one of the next things that we're going to be talking about is consumerism. Woo, right? And what does consumerism mean for, say, like our culture as Americans? Because all communities, all cultures consume something, right? It's either, if you look at very basic communities that just consume basic needs, basic goods, versus the United States and Europe and a bunch of other places that consume stuff just to consume stuff, right? So what does this mean? Well, we have basically conditioned ourselves to be experts in the act of consumption. And our entire culture sort of depends on it. We consume all kinds of things like food, well, food, of course, but clothing and computers and cars and all of these different things that we have to engage in on a regular basis. We all have to look at, well, this is how we're going to keep up with our neighbors, right? And there's this sense of competition. And if you've ever lived in the suburbs and you look at your neighbors and they've got greener grass than you, well, you had better go out and get some, grass seed or some fertilizer to make your grass greener, so that you can keep up with them. Because this is an idea that we have to sort of keep up with the Joneses, right? If you've ever heard that term, that even if you don't necessarily believe in that, everyone else around you does, and so you have to be able to keep up. The American dream also sort of fits into that idea of consumption, right? Because we can go out and get anything that we want, right? And we can dispose of it. In fact, we have stuff that is basically created around this idea of planned obsolescence. You have cars that, if you go back 50, 60 years, well, there's still cars from that age that are still on the road. And there are cars from 10 years ago that are already worn out and being disused. If you look at computers and electronics, both of those things have got short lifespans, right? They're not designed to last. They're designed to be used for a while, and then the next greatest thing comes in, and then we have to buy it and consume it, and then it drives us to keep creating and create and keep consuming, and it becomes a part of our daily lives. Is this act of consumption? Of course, a lot of that comes with advertising, right? One of the things that we're always seeing out there is buy Coke, buy Pepsi, right? Buy Chevrolet, you should buy Ford or Dodge, and all these different things. And it's all advertising for you to, consume something else. And that's tough. There's a lot of stuff out there that, if you come right down to it, you don't need to consume all of this stuff. But we have created a culture that's based around consumption. And there are lots of cultures around the world that don't do the same thing. So, we as anthropologists are going to look at this and say, what kind of an impact is consumerism having on this country and around the world? And this is stuff that, we'll talk about, like global pollution, right? And all the stuff that we make here, or all the stuff that we have made over somewhere else in a different country, like Mexico or China, that gets imported here and then gets tossed away, destroyed, or sits in a dump for 1,000 years because it takes that long to, disintegrate. So, we have to look at how all of this is done. One of the things that I've done in my career is I've worked with graffiti writers. And graffiti writers have a very interesting approach to things. And not all of them do the same thing. Not just like any culture or any community, there are people that take a certain approach to one thing and take a different approach to others. But some of them that I've worked with are oftentimes motivated by political expression, or they are looking to get their name out for recognition within the community. It's done oftentimes to express some aspect of their lives to what's going on, right? And I've seen just absolutely amazing depictions of people, of ideas, of concepts, of language that's being expressed by these artists that are oftentimes considered to be counterculture, right? They're not a part of the art world. They're not a part of the establishment, right? And their venue is oftentimes the side of a building or an underpass along the highway. And so a lot of times you see these folks that are out there doing this kind of stuff, and they sometimes have a message that goes along with it. And it's really interesting to see how this community deals with these ideas of consumption, of art, of expression, of power. There's it changes. We'll have an entire class on art and expression, but if we go back and look at sort of the history of graffiti, it's always been seen as a very negative thing, that it was destructive. There's a guy in L.A., a graffiti artist, and they think that the city of L.A. has spent over $1 million just covering up his work alone. Just his. Not everyone else's. Just his. He has cost the city of Los Angeles $1 million just to cover up his artwork. I find that just ridiculous, right? But that's how it works, right? Counterculture, doing something that's against the system, and I find it fascinating to find out why. Why is this taking place? Why are you going out there and doing this? And then what ends up happening to the greater culture after years of graffiti writers out there doing this kind of stuff? If you've been around Denver in the last couple of years, especially like along Brighton Boulevard or down in Rhino, the River North District, there are streets and alleys that are just filled with amazing graffiti, because it's changed, right? If you look at like Mountain Dew, and I don't know if any of you drink Mountain Dew, I kind of recommend that you don't drink Mountain Dew, because it's terrible. Anyway, personal opinion. They took graffiti stylings and added it to their cans and to their promotions. And then all of a sudden Hollywood was like, hey, you know what? I think we can profit from this. And some of the guys that I worked with would be brought onto Hollywood sets, and they're like, hey, we need some graffiti right here. Could you do some graffiti? And so they'd start doing it. And they're like, wait. No, that's not the graffiti that we want. Not understanding the process of doing graffiti. They just wanted someone to go up and tag something, or, they had certain expectations. But all of a sudden, graffiti started becoming respectable. It started to become more of an art form that can be appreciated. It becomes an issue. And now it's changing. Right? Graffiti is now an art form that isn't looked down upon so much anymore. So, because we consumed graffiti, we consumed art, and all of a sudden it became acceptable. And now you've got graffiti artists that had intentionally done a lot of graffiti because it was counterculture, because it was going against the system. Now there's a demand for it. And what happens when that culture is now facing something very, very different than what it used to be? And that's what an anthropologist would look for. It's like, why is this changing? And how is this going to impact this community of graffiti writers and the consumers that are going to go in there? I mean, you can go and take tours around Denver just looking at graffiti. And that would never have happened 20 years ago. But it's happening now because, again, culture is changing. So next, I want you to do just an individual exercise. Take a few minutes to think about this, write it down, and give it some thought. I want you to think of something that influences culture through advertising, through multimedia, and why it was successful or unsuccessful. Okay, so take something that you've seen that influences culture and look at it through advertising and see why it was successful or not successful. You know, what are various things that could be like that? And then I'll give you like a couple of examples. One would be, well, like if you remember when President Obama was running for office and he had that poster, right? That was a really cool multicolored poster, and beneath it said hope, right? It said hope, right? A powerful message, right? And that's advertising, you know. And the same can be said for the MAGA hats for Trump. Whenever you see a red hat, a lot of people automatically assume it's a MAGA hat. So, great advertising. So think of something that you've seen or experienced that was either really successful or really unsuccessful. And just jot it down and think about it for a minute. And then we'll wait. Okay, we're back. So what did you come up with? Of course, if you want to tell me, you're more than welcome to. If you want to include it into your weekly reflection paper, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So we're going to talk a little bit again about globalization and culture and retouch on some things for this week. Because it is so important to understand how all of this fits together and why it's so important. Because as we grow in technologically advanced ways and being able to share the internet and trade and migration and immigration, we're constantly coming up with new ideas and exploring new ideas. And we have access to stuff around the world. And this is the great thing it's the great thing about globalism, is that now we can experience and enjoy things from around the world that we might not have had access to before. At the same time, if we look at the hegemonic process that the United States has on the world, that we're basically exporting culture around the world, we can see issues where there are cultures and communities that are slowly losing their own cultural identity and adapting or being forced to adapt to these Western American ideas. So it's a double-edged sword when we're dealing with globalism. There can be good things. There can definitely be bad things. There is without a doubt that Western civilization has gone to all four corners of the world and found itself there and has made an impact. Even just through maybe not even having direct contact, but it seeps in and Western culture is pushing its way in. And this can be a real problem for anthropologists as we look at languages that are disappearing literally on a weekly basis, and cultures that are disappearing, and communities that are dealing with new economic or environmental struggles because of globalism and hegemonic influence. And this has been developing kind of increasing speed for decades, since World War II, essentially when American culture started being exported around the world. And it's just, become more and more impactful all the time. When we have more and more movies, more and more TV shows and radio and music and stuff, it becomes much more important that this stuff is looked at and analyzed to see what kind of an effect it's having. Immigration and migration is something that becomes much more possible. And again, this can be both positive and negative. Specifically because, if a community ends up leaving and immigrating somewhere, they are essentially taking their impact for that community and removing it. So this happens a lot in rural communities, where you've got folks that end up moving to the big city. We'll talk about that in just a sec. So this can be a big issue that we have to look at, and can impact culture in so many different ways, because it's going to bring bits and pieces of this culture over here. And if you move into this culture, and we see this a lot in American history, for example, when you had immigrants coming from, let's say, Italy or France or someplace like that, where they came over and they decided that they were no longer going to speak their language. The language was English, and they were gonna learn English, and their kids were not going to learn the language of their homeland. They're going to learn English so that they can adapt and move into that community and become a member of that community. So, yeah, this can be a big issue, because you can lose that cultural identity if you leave and migrate somewhere else, or immigrate somewhere else. At the same time, it can also create a sense of diversity within a community. So you can create and have new influences coming in that can change and adapt. And that's where American ingenuity has always had a really interesting story, is the fact that a lot of the stuff that's happened in the United States happened because of immigrants. They came here, learned, and then made huge, especially in the scientific community, made huge impacts. So, yeah, there's again, double-edged sword of people coming here and going to other places, and having an impact on their communities. Okay, so one of the last things that we're going to talk about today is dealing with this issue of, again, hegemony, of cultural influence, and how people are moving from oftentimes rural communities to urban and metropolitan areas, and what kind of an impact it's having on those communities. One of the big issues is that, through industry, there's a lot of folks that have been, in the agriculture business or the lifestyle. And now you've got large corporations that are buying up these farms. And they are not able to compete with these big farms. And so they end up moving to the big city, right? Or they've got access to television or movies or music, right? And just imagine what it's like. And some of you probably have, I have, lived in a small town. And what it's like to have nothing to do, right? Man, you can get bored sometimes, you know, and then all of a sudden you watch what's going on TV and you see all this stuff that's going on in the cities and all these cool things that you can be doing, and it literally influences people to leave the rural communities and head towards big cities so that they have access to other things, better education, better access to services, medical services, more access to jobs. There might not be a lot of jobs in these rural communities, and that's another issue that's happening with globalism, is how industry is changing and becoming decentralized from oftentimes agrarian communities or smaller communities, and then shipped overseas. So what do you do? Where do you have to work? So a lot of folks end up moving to suburbs or to towns and cities to gain more access. And it has a big impact on those cities that are left behind. We're looking at oftentimes a crisis within rural America, that people are just up and leaving, right? They're not growing anymore. Cities like Denver, you know, the Denver metro area, 100,000 people moved here last year. Where do you think those people came from? You know, other cities, of course, yeah, but you know, a portion of that is going to come from those rural communities that are looking for more access, more possibilities, better health care, better chances at you know, getting a high-paying job. And this is one of the impacts that globalism has created. Being able to share that information, being able to make that hegemonic power, the American dream, becomes so enticing that it pulls people away from their communities. And so it's tough to deal with this kind of stuff and to see the impact on these communities and watch what they're going through. So as researchers, you know, we have to go out and see again, and I'll beat this into the ground. Why are we looking for this stuff? What's going on here? And is it something that is a natural process? Is this change just the natural process of this culture modifying? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it both? Right? What are the impacts going to be? And so we're going to look for that kind of stuff throughout the semester, how people change when they move to new communities. One final exercise, and again, I want you guys to do this on your own, and consider sort of the benefits and the drawbacks to this concept, the Cosmo effect, of how people are moving from one community to another, how people are adjusting to these communities, and what are the good things and what are the bad things, and then also consider what kind of an environmental impact might be taking place as people leave and move to new locations. What's happening at the old place? What's happening at the new place? Right? What kind of impacts might be there? So take a few minutes and write down some ideas. You know, talk it out with someone. What do you think? You know, one of the things that I had a professor of mine when I was doing my undergrad work. She gave me some fantastic advice. This was in a Westerns religions class. And she said, you know, before you take any test or exam, when you're studying for it, the first thing that you should do is you should go get drunk with your mother. Go get drunk with your mother and then talk about the test and talk about what you've learned in the class. And I thought that was hilarious. But the takeaway from it, and I do not recommend that you go out and get drunk with your mother, only if you want to, or only if you're, of age, is this idea that taking this information and then having a conversation with somebody can be really beneficial. Even if it's just like one question, what are the benefits and drawbacks of this? What are some of the environmental effects? Ask your roommate, ask a friend, ask a parent. And what do you think about this? What is your opinion about this? And they might have a good answer, they might not have a good answer. But it's through that conversation that you can come up with some really interesting ideas. So have that conversation. Don't just leave it in class or think about it as an individual, but ask people. And that's what anthropology is all about. I mean, that's what we do, is we go out and we talk to folks. And this is a good exercise for you to actually go out and ask some people, what do you think? So, after you do that, after you take a few minutes to have that conversation, let's talk about the conclusion. Or maybe you'll do this exercise after we do the conclusion here. Culture, right, is basically defined by a series of ideas, norms, values, symbols, and mental maps, and how we can explore culture and sort of break it down into bite-sized, consumable bits and pieces. It allows us to understand the ingredients of that culture, right? To understand what's going on, why things are happening the way that they are, and it gives us insight into that community. We talked about different ways and historical ways like social Darwinism from last week, and how contemporary, or actually not necessarily contemporary, but some early anthropologists changed ideas about that, putting things into a different historical perspective, and having this idea that cultures can be equal without necessarily being technologically superior than another one. They can be just as successful as another culture without having all the bells and whistles and all the technology. We have to look at culture and power, how it's fluid, how it's dynamic. We look at the fact that there's martial power and then hegemonic power. The power to control the economics and the behavior and possibly military versus power of influence, right? And both are very, very powerful ways of controlling and influencing people. We've also looked at aspects of biology, of genetics, and how we are looking at different ways how people are dealing with issues, right? Whether it's genetic trauma, that's or generational trauma, and also how our environment can have an impact on us culturally and biologically, and that how all of those sort of fit together to influence a community. We also have to look at the fact that culture is rarely ever specifically created. More or less it is modified. And this comes down to this concept that culture is never static. The only time culture becomes static is if it's dead. But we have got a long history of culture and how it's changed, and we can trace back our identities to other countries. And we can go back thousands of years and find out why we believe the things that we do. And we can trace that back to a long time ago. So, if we look at our history, and if we look at culture itself, it's always changing, and that's really important to understand as we look as scientists, especially apart from our early anthropologists that looked at culture in a static way. And one of the things that we have to accept is that culture isn't static, and it isn't isolated. It's always going to be influenced by your neighbors, especially now, right? With all of this influence coming in, media, politics, all of this stuff is influencing all of us all the time, and in that hegemonic way around the world. And that globalization is a massive part of all of this, and how it's changing our lives on a regular basis. So all of this stuff, we've covered a lot concerning culture. And that's because culture is extremely dynamic. It's all encompassing, and there are still things that we haven't even touched on. But it's important to understand the depth and the complexity of it. And the fact that if your head is currently spinning with all of the stuff that we've been talking about, I totally understand, because my head is constantly spinning as well as we, sort of dive into all these different aspects and how they all sort of fit together and become this one great big piece. If we think about puzzles, we have all these different things that fit together eventually, but it's so very complex. It deals with biology, it deals with your environment, it deals with the community that you grew up in, with your friends, with your parents, with your school, the government. I mean, the whole kit and caboodle, everything, can be a part of culture and can influence culture. And so when we try and study it, it takes a lot. It takes a lot. So as far as your homework is concerned, again, reflection paper. There's a lot of stuff that we covered. So write a page about any particular subject that we've discussed. What do you think? What are some issues that might come up? How did it make you feel? Was there anything that took you by surprise? Anything like that. Whatever you want to write about, but I want you to pick a subject and then think about it and come up with what you think about it. Not what we discussed in this class, but what is something that's unique to you, and critically think about that particular subject. Yeah, that's it. I hope you all have a great rest of your week. We will see you next week. I'm sorry, I'm pretty sure this was a fairly long lecture, at least I'm feeling it. So I hope you have a great time. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be good to each other. All right, we'll see you next week.